Kitty, it's so nice to have you here at Asbury.
Thank you.
And for the sake of the folks watching this, I'm actually going to read your bio from the back of your book.
All right.
So I want them to see the cover and read it, because I know they're going to want to Amazon.com it and buy it, or go to their local bookstore, or
That'd be great.
Contact Wiley and get it.
That is great.
Kitty Harris is the director of the Center for the Study of Addiction and Recovery at Texas Tech University. Are you still the Associate Dean?
Actually, as of August 31st, I am not.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Yes, as a former Associate Dean.
That's right.
My blessings on leaving that wonderful position of administration. And what is your current relationship with Ranch at Dove Tree?
I'm actually, by title, the executive director, but what I really do is just provide clinical oversight for the programming. It's not a day-to-day working relationship, but I oversee the clinical programming.
Is there anything else that should have been added to the back of this book that is more current with who you are and where you are?
Well, thanks for asking that. Probably, I'm working on a PhD curriculum in addictive disorders and recovery studies right now, which is exciting.
Yeah.
There's not one in the country, so we will have the first one, I hope.
So people who are now looking forward to a PhD program and wanting to focus on addictions and recovery should contact Texas Tech?
Texas Tech, yeah. I hope, if all goes well through the administrative channels, I hope we'll have it ready by the fall of 14. So that'd be good. The other thing I'm doing that I'm really excited about is I've taken a new appointment, which is one of the reasons I gave up my Associate Dean's position. And as a senior faculty in research, in order to put together an institute to study recovery science.
Oh, great.
And so we're going to be doing a lot of grant writing and work to begin to look at what is it that really helps people get in recovery and stay in recovery. With the stay being one of the big focuses. I think we've looked at recovery so much from a short-term standpoint. Let's get them into treatment, get them into recovery.
Past the immediate crisis.
Exactly. And I think what we haven't done a good job of is what really makes up the maintenance of long-term, lifetime sobriety and recovery from an addictive disorder. And so we're gonna do some neuroscience work with that, and we're gonna do some program evaluation work with that, and try to be able to answer some of the questions that really have not been looked at. Addiction has been studied a lot. Recovery has been studied very little.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, I think so. So I'm excited about that. It's kind of a new chapter, a new focus from what I have been doing.
Okay. Well, I know one of the things that I took from reading your book is your emphasis on a different model of recovery. And so I'd love just to have you talk with me a little bit about the genesis of that model and then tell me a little bit about the model.
All right. Thanks for reading the book, and thanks for noticing that was an important part of it. Throughout all of I've been working in the addiction field for about 30 years, and over and over and over, we've always heard references to the pain that people experience. And so I don't consider that totally an original thought at all. These days, I think nothing's particularly original thought when you read as much and go to as many conferences as we all do. But the idea that what addiction really reflected was a symptom of pain that we experienced in our life. And the model looks at those different types of pain and looks at the different behaviors that we use to try to feel normal in that pain, and then some of the negative consequences that occur from that, and then the real sense of shame we feel about what our behaviors and what our consequences are. The exciting part for me of the model, the new piece that I will lay some originality on, is the idea of the recovery part of that. So if we look at what's really happening to people, that there is this pain in their lives, instead of finding a compulsive behavior to deal with it, what if we found a coping skill to deal with it.
Because I really agree with the pain does not go away.
It does not go away.
It may change.
That's right.
The nature of pain changes, but there's no pain-free life.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that was part of what really excited me about this model, is that there's no way to live that kind of life, you know, whether it's physical pain, emotional pain, social, spiritual, any of those. You're gonna, at any time in your life, you're gonna have some parts of that working. So the recovery model that I think is exciting is based on changing out those compulsive behaviors for coping behaviors. And what you hope that does is allow you to build up some esteem, that you feel like, you know, I can handle this, I can do this, I can work with this. Which then leads to positive consequences in your life. You know, my family life's better, my job's better, my mental health is better, which builds. Then I think the key piece to recovery is resiliency. I mean, if I were to look at what recovery really is about, and from my perspective, and I think that is fairly well portrayed in the book, it is about resiliency. What have I put into myself that's going to allow me the skills necessary to bounce back? Because I'm going to get knocked down.
Yeah, it's just going to happen.
It's going to happen.
Scripture promises that.
It does promise that.
In this world you will have trouble. I don't know why I don't hear more sermons that emphasize that reality about living.
Absolutely. And that's why I think recovery is such a spiritual experience, as the 12-step programs portray, because we are promised that it's not going to be easy. And what we have to look at in recovery in terms of our survival is, what do I have to fall back on? I have my faith. I have some of the skills I've learned. I have my relationships with people that are, you know, supportive. And so I think when you look at addiction from that kind of model, what you find is hope. What you find is sustainability. That I can sustain this recovery if I have these skills. And what you also find is not a sugar-coated look at life. You know, it's the reality of that life is hard, you know. The old, you know, bad things happen to good people. You know, the old sense no one really escapes the pain of loss or death or disease or whatever. And the recovery model allows us the coping behaviors to stay in the world.
I really like that emphasis on resiliency. I totally am with you on that. It reminded me of some earlier research that I began hearing about. Not every child that grows up in an alcoholic home becomes an alcoholic.
That is correct.
And one of the distinguishing factors is that those who don't are more resilient than those who do.
That is right.
And
absolutely.
So it's like, oh, well, that's like the duh factor.
Yeah.
If that's what they possess that keeps them out of addictions when it's been modeled, isn't that the missing piece for those who get into addictions?
You are absolutely right. And that's a great way to look at it. That's a great way to bridge that. And some of the research that we've done on prevention shows that same thing. That so many kids that are put in positions where you would think their lives would be completely destroyed, and they ask them, how did you come out of that? How did you live that way? And they begin telling stories of really resilience.
And often that has to do with a relationship.
Absolutely.
Someone who is modeling a different way, who saw something different about them, who called forth the image of God. And gave them tools then to nurture that.
Oh, that is so true. I used to teach a class on prevention, and the one thing I told them, if you walk out of here and you don't remember anything else, which is fine, that happens in class, don't forget this, is that the single most important factor we have found in all of the prevention literature is the connection with one other person other than a family member that shows some interest in your worth and your competence. And that seems to be one of the most important factors, not only in prevention, but also in resiliency. And that's why AA sponsors, 12-step sponsors, counselors, youth ministers are my favorite. I've seen so many youth ministers work miracles in children's lives. So if you can find that one other person that kind of believes in you, that cares about you, it goes a long way.
I think that one of the obstacles to that is the secrecy and shame.
Right.
That goes along with it.
Right.
Since shame promotes hiding or defensive anger.
Right.
Those kids or those women, I'm going to switch to talking about women, may not be there. They're so ashamed about what's going on that they keep it so secret that it really takes building a relationship. And even then, shame is such a powerful lie about who we are.
Absolutely, and I'm glad that you made that segue, because that's exactly what I thought of when you said shame. One of the themes of the book, and I think one of the things that I really tried to do, was to help people understand that women drink with more shame oftentimes than men do. You know, for many people, a guy is on his way home from work, he stops off at the bar, has a beer or two with a couple of his buddies and goes home, and you know, they don't find anything wrong with that. But if you switch genders and a woman stops off at the bar on their way home from work, has a couple of beers, and shows up at home to fix dinner intoxicated or to help with homework, then there's a completely different attitude about that.
Yes.
And one of the things that women struggle with in terms of addictive disorders is that they are seen oftentimes as the glue in the family. And when that's not happening, then there's the shame of drinking, which is horrible, but there is the shame of being neglectful of the family, which is even worse. And so what you find with female alcoholics oftentimes is that they carry several levels of shame. They carry the shame of the behavior and the alcoholism. They carry the shame of the decrease in family functioning, not being a good wife, not being a good housekeeper. And then at that highest level, they carry the shame of not being a good mom.
Yeah.
And so one of the things in working with women is to be able to find some ways to diffuse that to the point that they can actually get past that shame to get well. It's very difficult.
And shame is so painful.
Oh.
I mean, I don't think that we realize how devastatingly painful shame is. And the nature of shame is it's private.
Yes.
It's created in relationships.
Yes.
I mean, it's a relational statement.
Right.
But then we bury it privately.
Right.
It's kind of like a cancer to my soul.
Well, and that's a great way to put it. That's a great way to put it. It is a cancer to the soul. And I think that's part of what makes addiction so difficult to get to, is that you're asking people to dig into that cancer in their soul and find a way to pull it out. And that is just beyond painful.
Yeah.
You know, it's one thing, and again, a lot of it's stigma and stereotypes in our culture. You know, if you refer to a guy, oh, he's just a drunk. Well, that's not a kind thing to say, but if you refer to a woman as a drunk,
there's a whole level
of
stigma on that.
that goes with that. And so I think that one of the real struggles with women is getting them to get past that shame, like you said, to pull at that cancer in their soul, and look at themselves through a different set of eyes. As someone that is worth saving, that is worth recovery, that because of her addiction, it doesn't mean she's a horrible mom. You know, a lot of the women that I've worked with through the years in therapy, and that were interviewed for the book, they talked about drinking patterns that were amazing in order to protect their images as moms and wives. One woman in particular, I remember, she never drank until everyone was in bed at night. All the dishes were done, all the kids' bedtime stories were told, her husband had fallen asleep, and she would begin drinking oftentimes at 11 o'clock or midnight at night, and drink completely isolated, alone, until 4 or 5 in the morning, sleep for an hour or so, and then get up and do lunches and breakfast and whatever. And that was her pattern. And the pattern was strictly constructed that way in order to avoid the shame of feeling like she didn't do the things she needed to do as a wife and mother.
Right, so that she could keep the image of being the perfect mom and the perfect wife.
Right. And that's
then maintaining that image then adds its own level
it does.
of
it does.
shame and compulsivity to maintain. What a vicious cycle.
Yeah, some of the moms that you run into that look like kind of, I call them moms on steroids.
Yeah.
You know, they're perfect, everybody looks perfect, everything is perfect. Those are the ones I have the most concern about, because they have worked so hard to keep the image up in order to counteract the shame they feel for their drinking, that they have worked themselves into, you know, this frenzy of being super mom, which is so sad.
And then let's add the level of spirituality on top of that, because super moms are also going to be super moms in the church.
Absolutely.
And our most prized volunteer, because the church door is open, they're going to be there. They're probably heading the children's ministry, leading the choir, working nonstop in the women's ministry, and don't poke too deeply.
You're exactly right. Don't, once you start checking in, poking around, you're in trouble. But you're right. There are so many women that eventually show up for treatment and it's funny because there are a lot, and I want to maybe contrast this with the men a little bit. People say, well, did you know that Joe went to treatment? Oh, I'm so glad. He has such a bad drinking problem, and bless his heart. And on the same level, if you shift it around to some women that I know and have worked with, oh, well, did you know that Mary went to treatment? What?
Yeah.
What? Yeah. Mary? Oh my gosh, because she was in charge of the children's ministry. She was president of the PTA. She was the soccer mom. You know, and I think it's interesting because there's always much more surprise of women seeking treatment than men, because the image has been so well protected by them. And what a burden to carry. And you know, and even spiritually, I think sometimes that that struggle with women too spiritually. If I'm not who I say I am not who I am, you know, trying to portray to my children I am, and that conflict of, you know, who I am and who I say I am is such a spiritual conflict anyway. And
I'm sitting here wondering, to what degree does our culture also contribute to that?
Oh.
You know, I'm just reflecting back that, you know, what did my grandmother, she happened to work out, I come from a family where women have always worked outside the home. However, the expectation for that, and you know, I can bring home the bacon and fry it up in the pan. You remember that commercial?
I do.
Yeah, I thought you would.
I do.
But the pressure to be everything, do everything, compete, plus, you know, you're not only working full-time when you're in the work marketplace and doing it as competently as you're capable, and I want to add as competently as men, because that's often in male-dominated industries. That would be the subtext to that.
That's right.
But then I'm coming home and expected to carry on as if I'm a full-time homemaker. And we can't. There's just not enough hours in the day or energy or bandwidth to do all that.
And that there's actually one of my favorite paragraphs in the book speaks to that. That there is so much put on working outside the home, working in the home, and this is what's interesting, I think, about the use of alcohol and other chemicals. In that setting is that it sometimes provides the only relief that women have from the pressure and the stress of all of the different roles that they assume. And when you talk to women about their drinking, you find very few women that will say, you know, I just wanted to party and have a good time. That's not what you hear. What you hear is, you know what, I was just exhausted.
Yeah.
I was just at the end of
relax.
my rope. I couldn't relax.
I couldn't turn my mind off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you find that oftentimes women's entrance into addictive disorders, especially alcoholism, is through a very different door than many men go through. And it is more about relaxing. It is more about turning your mind off. It is more of an escape. It's often treatment for anxiety. You know, alcohol is a great medication for anxiety disorders. It doesn't work, but it's a great at the time. And so you find that the motives are different for women, the way they drink is different, the shame is exacerbated for women, and that therefore all the way around, women in addiction represent an entirely different picture than we've seen, I think, previously.
So do the treatment models for women need to change?
You are so good. You are a really good interviewer. I'm serious, because I that's the first thing I thought about when I said that. I need to talk about treatment. Yes, they do need to change, and that's one of the things. It's interesting. The research that we have on addiction and on alcoholism, it was primarily done in male populations in VA hospitals.
Now that I wasn't aware of.
Yes, absolutely, because that was kind of a set population that could be accessed.
Yeah,
and
combat, that's
right.
certainly is a woman's role in world.
And that's right, not.
Yeah.
And so back in the 50s, even into the 40s and 50s, that a lot of the treatment programs were constructed around that particular population, older males, VA hospitals.
Confrontational.
Yeah. And so here we sit talking about women in addiction and recovery, and you are so on target. What we have to do is we have to do that differently. That when you look at treatment for women, there's some other things that you have to look at. A lot of times it's really important to look at trauma work. A lot of women have gone through trauma either from families of origin or nuclear families. And I don't believe any woman's program is complete without a trauma track somewhere if needed. I think you have to look at the roles that women play in family. So I think family therapy and family work in women's treatment is incredibly important. If you only treat the individual person and you haven't done anything to help with what that family looks like, you have done an incomplete job of getting, and I think that's true of men too, and so I need to say that, but I think for women it is especially important. One of the major deterrents to women getting treatment are their children. You know, a man can go off to treatment and leave mom home with the kids. Well, oftentimes if mom needs to go to treatment, that same option is not available for her. And so some treatment centers have been somewhat experimental in trying to treat mom and children together. And that's difficult, but it's an ideal situation, especially if there are younger children, to not separate them out. Treatment also has to look at that, as you mentioned, confrontational. Many women don't do well in confrontational therapy settings, so using more of a cognitive behavioral approach or more of a spiritual approach, more of a rational emotive kind of approach, you know, can be better. And so I think you have to look at treatment a little bit different. The other thing that no one likes to hear is that I think oftentimes women need to stay in treatment longer because
really?
they have worked harder to cover up.
That makes sense.
They have worked so hard to cover up. They've built an image. And I think sometimes breaking through that is sometimes more difficult because their ability to cover up has been stronger. You don't find a lot of men that we call closet drinkers, but you find a significant number of women that you find closet drinkers because they drink in secrecy, they drink in privacy, and dealing with that level of alcoholism is a little bit different.
I'm thinking about some young women that I know who have said, and I know this is their motivation, I'm going to go out tonight and get blasted. Their goal was drink to oblivion.
Right.
And that was their goal for the weekend.
Right.
And I've always associated that more my stereotype with men.
Right.
You know,
Right.
the how many shots can you take, and the competitiveness of that. Is there a shift in how women drink depending on the age group in which they are?
Yes, you really did read the book. Yes, there is. I think one of the chapters in there is called, BFFs, Best Friends Forever, and there is a shift. Younger girls, and this is a sad thing, younger girls are engaging more in binge drinking than they were 10 years ago, even probably 5 years ago, and where the intent of binge drinking is to get drunk. The intent of social drinking is to relax a little bit, socialize, maybe take a little bit of edge off those inhibitions. That is not the intent of binge drinking. The intent of binge drinking is escaping into oblivion and hopefully not throwing up all over yourself while you're doing it. And we're finding younger and younger girls that are dealing with this type of drinking rather than just being an all-male thing. One of the things that's interesting, and I think it's worth mentioning, no attack on the media, let me say that, but girls were marketed to. I mean, there was a part of the population that the alcohol industry had not tapped into 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. Guys drank beer. What did girls drink? Nothing. There really wasn't anything to drink. Thus the invention of the pink, bubbly wine spritzer. Or the cute little...
I was thinking wine coolers.
Wine coolers, wine spritzers, daiquiri, little strawberry
drinks.
daiquiris and whatever. And part of what happened, and happened with cigarette smoking also, which is interesting because, women didn't really want to smoke Marlboros, but Virginia Slims were a little bit, sexy and suggestive, and that might be good. Marketing did the same thing with alcohol with girls, and so where typically you wouldn't see age of onset for female drinkers till maybe into college, you began starting to see it in high school because they had an acceptable wine cooler to drink that was pink and bubbly and sweet and tasted good. And then you began to see some of that even in junior high school. And so part of what has happened with girls drinking, which is an interesting phenomenon to me, is not as much maybe sociological evolution as it is a marketing evolution. That all of a sudden there was something that was acceptable to drink. I remember back, when I was in school, which was like a long time ago, but girls just didn't drink beers because it just wasn't very feminine. That's what guys did. Well, the liquor industry has changed that significantly, and so you find girls that at a younger age drink to oblivion because that's what they want to experience, and they now have the means to do it.
I'm connecting a piece that what you're saying with media with part of another book that I'm reading. And the research that was reported in there had to look at the association between television viewing and violence, which the conclusion was the more television viewing, the greater the violence was. But with neuroscience studies, what the reporting was is that even programs like as innocent as Leave It to Beaver or Mother Knows Best back in the 50s, what television does is it heightens the limbic emotional system, so you get an emotional rush minus a cognitive rational analysis piece.
Oh, fabulous.
Combine that with drinking.
Absolutely.
So the more you watch television, and I'm going to claim that maybe the show Jeopardy is the exception because you've got to think.
That's right. I know.
Thinking person's game show.
And I do love Jeopardy.
But why do I watch television? I don't watch much of it. It's because I'm too tired and I don't want to think.
That's right.
And so any type of viewing, movies, videos, any type of that is challenging, is training us to turn off an analytical, rational decision-making mode and enhancing our emotional responses in our limbic system without the guidance
Absolutely.
of an analytical process.
Right. And I think I think that example, which is really good in the use of alcohol,
Yeah.
it comes together in
Yep.
that sense of escape.
Yes.
It is really about escape.
And anxiety management.
Absolutely. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to dwell on it. I don't want to be sitting in it. And if I turn on, whatever the show is, then that offers me some level of escape. Absolutely. That is totally correct. One of the things that I think is interesting, and I think that there's a real spiritual basis for this also, is that somehow we appropriately and yet maybe to our own deficit, we want to escape reality and pain. And nobody wants to be in pain, but I think more than ever culturally, and certainly I found that in
the United States, I think that's really true.
And I found that in interviewing women for this book, is that there is this tremendous desire to escape from whatever that the moment of reality is. And I think that television, movies, drinking, all those things provide that kind of escape.
What fairy tale has not ended with, and they all lived happily ever
That's
after?
right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And they struggled for the rest of their lives with issues about this and that and the other thing, and yet they survived.
Right.
Yeah.
And really, alcoholism and addiction is really, at its most basic form, is seeking out an altered state of consciousness. And that really is it. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. I can go run for 5 or 6 or 8 miles, and I feel better, And so that's the same thing. There are people that get addicted to exercise, in that same way, because it's always that sense of what can I do just to feel a little bit more comfortable, a little bit calmer, a little bit. Prayer and meditation is a great way of a calming effect on the body, and so there are ways to do that, but underneath all of it is that desire to kind of escape from this moment. So
I know that you've developed programs for universities to help students in recovery stay, thrive, and succeed. Could you talk about how some of those principles might translate into the local church setting?
Yes, I can. And that's a great question. What we've done a lot is develop what we call collegiate recovery communities. And so at any given point, that can be, doesn't have to be collegiate, but I think what you transfer into the local church setting is a place where people come together, a place where it's safe to share their secrets, a place that is all kind of open for people to drop in and visit and talk about what they're struggling with. I think that one of the struggles we all have in looking at recovery within church sometimes is, gosh, everybody's supposed to look good. And in recovery, it's important to just be where you are, which is a mess. A mess. And so I think churches opening their doors and beginning the dialogue to understand that. I will never forget one time going to a church and the minister getting up and beginning the sermon and said, I'm Tom and I'm a recovering alcoholic. And the whole congregation was like, because those kind of dialogues just didn't happen in church. And so I think the beginning of making it okay to not be okay is probably the first movement that churches can make. I think youth ministers, I was a youth minister one summer of my life, and I will never forget that. Just the intensity with which you could relate to the kids. I loved it. And I think, in terms of this population, certainly having a youth minister or a college minister or a woman in charge of women's ministry, wherever the struggle is, to have someone that people are willing to talk to that will listen, and that will listen appropriately, as you mentioned earlier today. What a gift! You know, you don't have to be a therapist. You don't have to be an addiction counselor. You know, you don't have to be a clinical psychologist. You know, what you have to be is someone that is willing to hear someone's struggle with the grace and the compassion that God gave us to love each other. Yeah. And if you can do that, then you have you know, I think from my perspective, spiritually, you have done what God has asked us to do for each other, is to love one another at that level of our own pain.
Kind of truthing it in love.
Yes, absolutely.
Or loving it in truth,
absolutely.
however you want to put it.
Absolutely.
Well, Kitty, thank you so much for sitting down and chatting with me about one of your passions.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having good questions.
Oh, you're welcome.
I appreciate it.
You're welcome.